deep, dark forest, where no human foot has stepped for decades. The air is filled with the damp scent of decaying leaves, and the silent trees stand like giant witnesses to an ancient secret. A lonely house on the edge of the forest, with peeling walls and windows that seem to stare into emptiness. Its doors barely hang on rusty hinges, and the roof is covered with thick moss. Sir, he stopped at the gate, holding a yellowed letter in his hands. It was a letter from his late uncle, which had mysteriously appeared after his death. The letter mentioned something important that was supposed to be kept here. But there were also a few lines crossed out with ink, which he couldn't decipher. His heart pounded harder with every step toward the door. He wasn't a coward, but there was something about this place that constricted his throat and made him glance back every few seconds. When he touched the door handle, a chill pierced him to the bone, and a faint whisper, like the wind, swept around him. He firmly pressed against the door. A creak, and the darkness inside the house swallowed him. "Only forward, sir," he whispered, stepping across the threshold. The darkness embraced him as if the building itself were alive and resented any intrusion. The flashlight in Sir's hands pierced through thick dust and the grey gloom of rooms that seemed dead for centuries. Old furniture stood as if the owners had simply stepped out and never returned. But the worst part was that the silence didn't feel natural. It pressed down like a heavy blanket, pulsing with an eerie, almost alive rhythm. Sir, he cautiously moved to the center of the room, feeling every creak under his feet like a treacherous signal announcing his presence. Suddenly, his gaze fell on an old dresser in the corner. Its doors were slightly ajar, and a piece of paper peeked out from within. He stepped closer and picked it up. It was an old, yellowed sheet of paper with a drawing. It depicted some creature, humanoid in shape, but with a strangely elongated face and eyes that seemed to follow you no matter how you turned the page. Below, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "It watches. It is always here." Sir, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A cold breath, like a touch from the grave, brushed against his neck. He spun around sharply, shining his flashlight. The room was empty. "Nerves, just nerves," he whispered to himself, but the sensation of being watched clung to him, unrelenting. Then, something strange happened. From another room, behind a closed door, came a sound. It wasn't just a rustle, it was a distinct thudding, like someone shifting their weight heavily from foot to foot. Sir, he froze, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the sinister silence of the building. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to infuse his voice with confidence. Silence answered him. But it was unnatural, like the calm before a storm. He felt something light and invisible glide through the air nearby. His flashlight began to flicker. And then he saw it. In the mirror hanging on the wall beside him, something appeared. A shadowy figure with hollow, black, abyss-like eyes stood behind him. He turned around sharply, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the mirror, it was empty, but on its surface was a clear mark, a handprint, as if someone had touched the glass from the other side. The chill slowly crept under his skin, but he forced himself to breathe and move forward. Greater horrors lay ahead. Sir, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his heart, which was pounding a wild rhythm. The flashlight in his hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to move forward, though every step felt heavy, as if an invisible force resisted his advance. The corridor stretched long and dark, its walls blackened by time or fire, and shards of glass and debris crunched beneath his feet. It felt as though the house was alive, faint creaks of wood resembled the drawn-out sighs of an ancient creature. Sir, he approached the door from which the earlier sound had come. It was half open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Something deep inside him begged him not to enter, but curiosity and some unexplainable force pulled him closer. He pushed the door, and it creaked open slowly. Inside the room was an old writing desk, atop which lay another yellowed piece of paper. But that wasn't what caught his attention. In the center of the room stood a wooden cradle, rocking gently back and forth, though the air was still. He froze, peering into the cradle's shadows. He thought he saw something there. Stepping closer, his flashlight illuminated a small doll with glassy eyes that seemed to follow his every movement. The doll was old and tattered, but its arms and legs were bound with red threads, as if it had been tied up. Beside the doll lay a small silver knife with a handle engraved with intricate runes. He reached out, intending to touch the doll, but just as his fingers were about to graze it, something unimaginable happened. A sudden, piercing sound shattered the silence, a baby's cry. It was so vivid and loud that he recoiled, nearly dropping the flashlight. The crying came from the cradle itself, though it was clearly empty. This is impossible," he whispered, trying to keep panic at bay. But the crying didn't stop, it grew louder and more piercing with every passing second. Then, abruptly, it ceased. A dead silence fell, so oppressive that even his own breathing felt deafening. And then, he felt it, a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around sharply, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In the darkness stood a figure. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its entire form seemed to shimmer, as though it were woven from mist. Its hollow, black eye stared directly at him. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, forcing Serhi to step backward. His flashlight flickered again, and the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. But the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening crack, cutting off his escape. The walls began to creak and groan, and from the window came a wild, inhuman laughter. It echoed through the room, surrounding him, mocking him, reveling in his terror. He rushed to the door, slamming his shoulder into it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, he heard it, a sound. Slow, heavy footsteps, drawing closer and closer. The footsteps grew closer and closer. He stood frozen by the locked door, his heart pounding so fiercely it felt as though it might burst from his chest. He tried to steady the flashlight in his hands, but they trembled uncontrollably, and the beam of light darted frantically around the room like a frightened animal. When the footsteps suddenly stopped, silence filled the air, a silence more terrifying than any sound. "Who are you?" He croaked, his voice trembling as he squinted into the darkness. He didn't expect an answer, but one came. A guttural whisper cut through the air, both near and distant. "I am always here." He felt cold seep into his lungs, and he struggled to breathe. The figure reappeared, this time closer, just a few meters away. Its face became clearer, the skin was pale and translucent, like fog, and its eyes were bottomless black voids. But the worst was its mouth, it didn't move as it spoke. The voice seemed to come from the emptiness that the figure carried with it. It extended a hand, thin and elongated, like a skeletal branch. He felt an unseen force pulling him closer. His legs seemed to buckle on their own, dragging him toward the figure. He stopped only when his flashlight suddenly flared with a bright, blinding light and then went dark. Darkness enveloped him, but now he could hear the heavy breathing of the creature, just inches away. "You brought it with you," the whisper came directly into his ear. He felt an icy, almost frozen hand rest on his shoulder. He screamed, wrenched himself free, and ran blindly, no longer caring where he was going. His footsteps echoed through the house as he darted into another room and slammed the door shut behind him, gasping for breath. The room was pitch black, but something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, as if filled with smoke or mist. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed the floor was covered in carvings and symbols etched directly into the wooden planks. In the center of the room lay an old journal, its blackened pages stained with dark spots resembling dried blood. Cautiously, he approached it and opened the journal. The text inside was written in an incomprehensible language, but the final page was different. It was a note scrawled in his uncle's handwriting. "I let it out. I thought I knew how to stop it. I was wrong. If you are reading this, run. But know this, it will always find you." Sir, he slammed the journal shut as the door behind him creaked open slowly. He turned around, clutching the journal as if it were a shield, but there was nothing in the doorway. Instead, a shadow began to pool on the floor. It stretched, grew, and rose, taking the shape of the creature. Now it stood before him in all its horrific glory. Its body resembled gnarled, intertwined roots dripping with a dark, viscous liquid that pooled on the floor. Those same black, abyssal eyes were locked onto him. It took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned under its weight. "You stayed too long," it whispered. Sir, he backed away, but his heels hit the wall behind him. The creature extended its long arm and touched the journal he held. Instead of snatching it, it whispered, "This is your key, and your curse." The journal opened on its own, its pages flipping rapidly. A piercing scream erupted from within, shaking everything around him. The walls trembled, the air itself seemed to vibrate, and the scream drilled into Sirhi's mind like 1,000 needles. The scream that erupted from the journal's pages was so loud that the house's walls seemed to shudder from the sound. Sirhi tried to close the journal, but his hands suddenly went numb, as though he were holding something alive and lethally dangerous. Darkness began to pour out of the book, enveloping the room in a dense, oppressive gloom. He could feel the creature moving closer, its breath colder than ice. With a final effort, Sirhi hurled the journal onto the floor. It landed with a dull thud, and to his astonishment, the shadows emanating from it began retreating, as if the journal itself was pulling them back. The creature froze in place, its body twisting unnaturally, as if in pain. But the reprieve lasted only a moment. "You cannot escape," it whispered before its figure dissolved into the surrounding darkness. Relief washed over Sirhi for only a second before the realization hit him, this wasn't over. The journal began to tremble on the floor, and the symbols etched into the walls of the room started glowing with an eerie crimson light. From the hallways of the house, he heard movement, multiple entities, not just one. Their footsteps were slow, deliberate, but drawing ever closer. Grabbing the journal, Sirhi understood that it was somehow connected to this nightmare. Perhaps it held a clue to stopping this madness. But there was no time to read it. The footsteps grew louder, and the light from the symbols now filled the room. That's when he noticed a small opening in one of the walls, a ventilation duct, old and rusted. Without hesitation, Sirhi made his way to it, fighting the fear threatening to paralyze him. He wrenched the cover off the opening and crawled inside. The space was so tight he had to almost drag himself forward, but it was better than staying in that cursed room. As he moved, a new sound reached him, a thin scratching noise. It came from behind him, matching his every movement. Sirhi quickened his pace until his hand brushed against something pinned to the wall, a note. It read, "The key is in your blood." Accept the sacrifice, or become one of them. His heart stopped for a moment. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but the words filled him with a deep, visceral dread. The scratching behind him grew louder. He turned his head and saw something that made him scream, a dark hand, resembling a tangle of gnarled roots, reaching toward him. He pulled out the knife he'd found earlier in the cradle and struck at the hand with all his strength. A wail echoed through the narrow tunnel as the hand recoiled, but only briefly. In the shadows ahead, he saw a horde of these creatures advancing toward him from every direction. Panic overtook him. The key is in my blood, he thought, clutching the knife. His hands trembled, but he realized there was no other choice. He made a small cut on his palm, letting his blood drip onto the blade. Instantly, the knife began to glow with an intense, otherworldly light. The light was so bright it filled the tunnel, forcing the creatures to halt and retreat. Their forms began to dissolve, like shadows vanishing at dawn. He used the opportunity to crawl forward as fast as he could until he reached the end of the tunnel, emerging into another part of the house, a damp, decaying basement. He collapsed onto the cold, wet floor, gasping for air. But even here, safety eluded him. Whispers and faint laughter echoed from every corner, maddeningly close and yet impossible to pinpoint. In the center of the basement, something enormous and dark began to rise. It was the true form of the entity that had haunted him. Its body was a mass of writhing roots and shadows, dripping with the same viscous, dark liquid. The black voids of its eyes locked onto him with malevolent intent. This was it. He now understood, this was his final chance to figure out how to end it all. The basement was enormous, far larger than he could have imagined. The walls seemed to vanish into thick darkness, and the cold air carried the stench of damp decay and rot. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered in strange, glowing red symbols. Above it rose something massive and horrifying, a form like a shadow that devoured light itself. This creature was woven from darkness, its body twisting with hundreds of trembling tendrils that resembled writhing snakes. Its face was featureless, except for two black voids where eyes should have been, staring directly at him. Slowly, it extended its arms toward the altar, as though preparing to complete a ritual. He knew, if that ritual was completed, it would all be over. But how could he stop it? He looked again at the knife in his hand. The blood on the blade now glowed faintly, and the knife felt warm, almost alive. He stepped closer to the altar, and the creature froze, as if sensing his intent. Its voice, a cacophony of countless others speaking as one, boomed through the air. You cannot save yourself. You are part of this. Your blood has always been mine. He stopped in his tracks. Voices buzzed in his head, as though the creature was trying to invade his mind. He remembered the words from the note, the key is in your blood. Could it mean that he had unwittingly been the one to release it? His hands trembled, but he forced himself to focus. The symbols on the altar began to shift as he raised the knife. They pulsed, as though resisting him. The creature moved suddenly, its tendrils stretching out, ready to ensnare him. He acted without thinking. He drove the knife into the center of the altar. A blinding light erupted from the altar, flooding the room. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream that shook the walls and sent flying backward. He hit the cold floor, the knife slipping from his grasp. The light slowly dimmed, and with it, the shadowy form of the creature began to dissolve, as though it were made of smoke. You change nothing, its voice faltered and faded, dissipating into the air. The glowing symbols on the altar went dark, and an eerie silence descended upon the room. Serhi lay on the ground, gasping for air. He couldn't believe it was over, but was it really? As he lifted his head, his gaze fell upon the knife. It now appeared ordinary, its glow extinguished. But something felt wrong. In the far corner of the basement, written in blood on the wall, was another message. "You are the next guardian. This is only the beginning." His blood ran cold. The feeling of triumph evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization that something had changed within him. He could feel a faint pulse of the shadows around him, as though they were now connected to him. But worst of all, he no longer felt alone. Something was with him, and it wasn't going away. Serhi picked up the knife, his hand still stained with blood. His heart pounded with fear. The shadowy creature might have vanished, but its whispers lingered, softly echoing in his mind. "You are mine now." Serhi sat on the cold floor, clutching the knife in his trembling hands. The air in the basement was heavy, suffocating, and the whispers in his head refused to stop. It was an endless cacophony of voices, pushing him to the brink of madness. The worst part was that he could now understand their words. "You are chosen. You are the keeper. You must serve." He rose to his feet unsteadily, feeling as though his body no longer entirely belonged to him. The house seemed to come alive. The basement ceiling began to crack, and roots, resembling those that formed the creature, crawled through the fissures, reaching toward him. They didn't attack, but hovered, waiting, as if for his command. "No!" Serhi shouted, fighting to shake off the terror that clung to him. His eyes landed on the journal, still lying near the altar. With renewed determination, he snatched it up and began frantically flipping through the pages. Every page, once incomprehensible, now seemed written in a language he could effortlessly read, as though it had always been within him. On the final page, he found the truth. "You have a choice. Destroy yourself to end the ritual, or become part of the creature and ensure its existence. There is no other way." His heart sank at the revelation. Destroy himself? He thought of everyone he had left behind in his life, his family, his friends, those who believed he had simply disappeared. And now he faced a choice where every path led to damnation. As he grappled with this reality, the darkness in the basement thickened. The figure of the creature materialized once again, though now it seemed less corporeal, its form flickering like a cloud of black smoke. It extended a hand toward him and whispered, "Accept me, and you will gain power beyond imagination. You will become a god in this world." Serhi felt the words clawing at his soul, tempting him. He watched in horror as shadows began to crawl up his arms and legs, coiling around him like living chains. Her power was seeping into him, and he could feel its intoxicating pull. But then, something else caught his eye. From the pocket of his jacket, a small photograph slipped out and fell to the floor. It was a picture of his parents and his sister, all smiling, happy and carefree. They were the ones he most wanted to protect. And it was their faces that gave him strength. "I will never become part of you," he screamed and, without hesitation, drove the knife into his own chest. The world erupted into blinding light. A surge of energy burst forth from his body, illuminating the entire basement. He felt something tear within him, as the shadows that had bound his soul shattered and dissolved. The creature let out a piercing scream as its form disintegrated, fragmenting into tendrils of mist that evaporated in the radiant light. It tried to reach for Serhi one last time, but was too weak. Its final whisper was barely audible. "This is not the end." Sir, he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Pain racked his body, but he could feel the darkness leaving him. The oppressive air in the basement lifted, and the room became silent, ordinary and still. There were no more voices, no more shadows. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the now empty darkness, his heart still pounding. When he finally woke up, the house was silent. It was as if everything that had happened had been just a dream. The altar was gone, as were all the symbols on the walls. But the knife still lay beside him, its blade now ordinary and unremarkable. With great effort, Sir, he rose to his feet and made his way toward the exit. As he stepped out of the house, the first thing he saw was the sunrise. The sun climbed over the horizon, casting warm light over the landscape. The forest, which had once seemed dead and menacing, was now alive with the sounds of birdsong and the fresh scent of morning carried on the breeze. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't truly the end. A part of the darkness remained within him. Its faint whisper occasionally echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that it could return. Yet now he understood how to stop it. Sir, he returned home. Life seemed to resume its normal course, but he could never fully let his guard down. Each night, as he lay in bed, the knife rested within arm's reach, just in case the darkness found him again.